What you are about to hear is the story of a man who had to choose between obedience and survival, between the oath he had sworn and the lives of the men standing behind him. It is drawn from the published memoir of Helmut Altner, from the written testimonies of German soldiers who lived through the final collapse of Berlin in April and May of 1945, and from the documented historical record of one of the most devastating urban battles in human history. This is not a story about glory. It is a story about what a man does when everything he was told to believe has burned down around him and all that is left is a decision. Berlin was dying, not slowly, not quietly, not in the way that things usually end. It was dying the way a building dies when the fire has already reached the top floor and the stairs are gone and there is nowhere left to go. It was the 25th of April, 1945, and the Soviet army had closed its ring around the city completely. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks. All of it pointed inward at what remained of a city of 4 million people, at the rubble and the smoke and the underground bunkers where men in uniforms were still receiving orders that had no connection to any reality that existed above ground. Helmut Altner was 19 years old. 19. He had been in uniform for less than a year. He was not a career soldier, not a hardened veteran, not a man who had chosen war as his profession. He was a boy from a small town who had been handed a rifle and a uniform and pointed at the enemy and told that Germany would be victorious, that the fatherland would endure, that every sacrifice was necessary and every order was righteous, and that to question any of it was to betray everything that mattered. He had believed some of this. He had doubted some of it. He had pushed the doubt down the way young men do when the alternative to belief is too frightening to look at directly. By April of 1945, the doubt was no longer something he could push down. It was everywhere. It was in the faces of the men around him. It was in the sounds coming from every direction, the artillery that never stopped, the aircraft overhead, the distant percussion of street fighting that was getting less distant by the hour. It was in the orders themselves, which had taken on a quality of complete disconnection from reality, orders issued by commanders who were either underground in bunkers or already dead. Orders that sent men to hold positions that no longer existed, to defend streets that were already rubble, to fight for a city that was already, in every meaningful sense, gone. He wrote about this in his memoir, and what makes his writing extraordinary is not its literary quality, though it has that, but its precision. Altner wrote the way a man writes when he has decided that the truth is the only thing left worth putting on paper. He wrote, "We were receiving orders from people who could not see what we could see. They were underground. We were above ground. And above ground, Berlin in April of 1945 was not a city anymore. It was a furnace. It was a place where the air itself tasted of ash and the ground shook constantly, and the buildings that were still standing looked surprised to still be standing, as if they knew it was only a matter of time." His unit was a scratch formation, which was the military term for something that had no other honest name. It was a collection of men who had been pulled from other units, other branches, other places, some of them soldiers with experience, Some of them boys like Altner with almost none. Some of them old men from the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, who had been handed weapons in the last desperate weeks and told to fight for their city. They ranged in age from 15 to over 60. They had different weapons, different training, different levels of understanding of what was actually happening. What they had in common was that they were all in Berlin in April of 1945, which meant they all shared the same rapidly diminishing future. The officer commanding Altner's group was a man named Lieutenant Bauer, not a famous man, not a man whose name appears in the history books, a man who had been a school teacher before the war, who had 2 daughters he had not seen in 8 months, and who had been given command of this group not because he was particularly qualified for it, but because he was the highest-ranking person available who was still alive and still standing. Bauer was 38 years old. He wore his uniform with the automatic habit of long practice, but his eyes, Altner wrote, had the look of a man doing constant internal calculations, a man running numbers in his head that he did not share with anyone else, but that were clearly not adding up to anything encouraging. The fighting in Berlin in those final days was unlike anything that had come before it, even in a war that had produced some of the most savage combat in human history. It was close. It was intimate in the worst possible way. It was fought building by building, floor by floor, room by room. The Soviet forces were methodical and overwhelming, and they were advancing. Every hour they were advancing. The German forces were falling back and falling back and falling back, and the city was contracting around them the way a fist contracts, and the men inside that contracting fist were running out of space and ammunition and water and any rational reason to keep doing what they were doing. Altner described one particular night in a destroyed apartment building in the Neukölln district. His group had taken shelter in what had been someone's living room. The furniture was still there, partially. A sofa with one end blown away. A bookcase with books still on the shelves. A child's drawing still pinned to the wall above what had been a desk. The building had no roof left. The sky above them was orange from the fires. Soviet artillery was impacting 2 streets away, close enough that the concussions came up through the floor into their feet. There were 14 men in the room. 14. A week earlier, there had been 26 in the group. The math was doing itself whether anyone wanted to look at it or not. He wrote, "I looked at the men around me in that room, and I tried to find something in their faces that resembled the faces I had seen in the propaganda posters. The fierce faces, the certain faces, the faces of men who knew what they were fighting for and believed in it completely. I could not find those faces. What I found instead were the faces of exhausted human beings who were afraid and hungry and who wanted, more than anything else on earth, to still be alive the next morning. That was all. That was the whole of it. Not victory, not the fatherland, just still alive tomorrow." Lieutenant Bauer received orders on the morning of the 27th of April. The orders were to advance toward the Tempelhof area to reinforce a defensive line to hold a specific intersection against Soviet armor. Bauer read the orders. He read them again. Then he folded the paper and put it in his pocket and said nothing for a long moment. Altner was standing close enough to watch his face while he read. He wrote later that he had never seen a man's expression go through so many things so quickly while remaining on the surface completely still. It was like watching weather move across a landscape from a great distance. You could see it was happening. You could see it was significant, but the details were too far away to read. Then Bauer did something. He called the men together, all 14 of them, in the ruins of that living room with the orange sky above and the child's drawing still on the wall. He stood in front of them and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was completely level, the way a voice gets when a person has made a decision and the making of it has burned away everything that was not essential. I have received orders. I am going to tell you what those orders are. And then I am going to tell you what I think about those orders. And then we are going to decide together what we do. This was not how the Wehrmacht worked. This was not how any army worked. Officers did not call their men together and tell them what they thought about orders and then consult them on what to do. The fact that Bauer did this in that room on that morning tells you everything you need to know about where they were and what it meant and what Bauer had calculated in the silence behind his still face while he read that piece of paper. He told them the orders. Then he told them what he thought. He said, "The position we are being told to hold does not exist anymore. The men we are being told to reinforce are either dead or have already retreated. The intersection we are being told to defend is currently behind Soviet lines. If we follow these orders, we will walk into a Soviet encirclement and we will die, all of us, within hours." He paused. Then he said, "I am not willing to give that order." The room was silent. Outside, the artillery continued its constant conversation with the earth. The orange sky flickered. Somewhere in the building, something shifted and groaned, and a small cascade of plaster fell from what remained of the ceiling. 14 men looked at their lieutenant. One of them, a corporal named Richter, who had been with the unit since the previous November and who had survived things that Altner did not yet know about, said, "What are the options?" And Bauer said, "There is one option. We surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets." This distinction was critical, and every man in the room understood it immediately and completely. The stories coming from the Eastern Front about Soviet treatment of German prisoners were not propaganda, or at least not only propaganda. They were the testimony of men who had been there, who had seen it. The Americans were different. The Americans, by the spring of 1945, had a documented record with prisoners of war, verified through the Red Cross, known to German soldiers who were paying attention. Surrender to the Americans was a different calculation entirely from surrender to the Soviets. But the Americans were not close. They were to the west. Getting to them from where Bauer's group was sitting in the ruins of Neukölln meant moving through a city that was simultaneously being bombarded from the outside and fought over street by street on the inside. It meant moving through Soviet lines or around them, or somehow between them. It meant making a journey that could end at any moment and in any number of ways, most of them terminal. It meant doing all of this while wearing German uniforms in a city where the SS was still shooting German soldiers they caught retreating without orders. That last part was not a small detail. The SS security units, the Feldgendarmerie, the military police of a state that was collapsing but had not yet stopped functioning, they were still active in Berlin in the last days of April. They were stopping men, checking papers, looking for deserters, and they were hanging or shooting what they found. There were bodies on lampposts in parts of the city, German soldiers with signs around their necks that said "coward" or "traitor." The terror apparatus of the Reich was one of the last things to stop working. Bauer knew this. Every man in that room knew this. Altner wrote, "When the lieutenant said we would surrender to the Americans, I felt two things at exactly the same moment. The first was relief so intense it was almost physical, like putting down a weight I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was there. The second was terror, not of the Americans, of the journey, of what stood between us and that surrender, of the men in black uniforms who were still out there, still looking, still hanging people from lampposts for the crime of wanting to live. They moved at night. This was the only rational choice, darkness being the one resource that was still equally distributed between the living and the dead, between the hunters and the hunted. 14 men moving through the ruins of Berlin, trying to move west without being seen by Soviet patrols coming from the west or SS units that could appear from any direction. Bauer led them not with the confidence of a man who knew the way, but with the careful, methodical attention of a man who is making the calculations one step at a time and refusing to look too far ahead because too far ahead was not survivable to think about. They moved through streets that were not streets anymore, through buildings that were not buildings anymore, through a city that was in the process of becoming something that had not existed before and had no name yet. The fires were everywhere, not as catastrophe, but as permanent condition, the normal state of things, so that the darkness was never fully dark, but always orange-tinged, always flickering, always casting the moving shadows of men through the ruins of what had been someone's home, someone's shop, someone's school. They lost 2 men in the first 3 hours, not to combat, not to the enemy, but to the city itself, to a building collapse that happened without warning, a section of wall that had been standing on nothing but habit and suddenly remembered that it had no reason to keep standing. 2 men went into the rubble and did not come out. The group did not stop. Bauer made the decision without words, without ceremony, without the luxury of grief, because grief was something for later, for the people who made it to later. And right now, there was only the next street, the next shadow, the next calculation. On the second night, they encountered something that Altner wrote about at length because it shook him in a way that even the worst of the combat had not. They came across a group of German soldiers going the other direction, not retreating, not surrendering, but advancing, still following orders, still moving toward the Soviet lines with the purposeful momentum of men who had decided that the orders were real and the war was real and that their job was to keep doing their job regardless of what any observable fact suggested about the outcome. There were perhaps 20 of them, led by a young lieutenant who could not have been much older than Altner himself, and when Bauer's group encountered them in the ruins of a gutted factory building, there was a moment of mutual assessment that had a quality of complete unreality about it. The young lieutenant looked at Bauer. Bauer looked at the young lieutenant. The young lieutenant asked where they were going. Bauer said they were repositioning on orders. The young lieutenant nodded. He didn't ask which orders. He didn't ask where they were going specifically. Perhaps he didn't want to know. Perhaps he was doing his own calculations behind his own still face, and the answers were not ones he was ready to say out loud in front of his men. He and Bauer looked at each other for a moment longer, two men on opposite sides of a decision that both of them had already made, and then the young lieutenant led his men onward toward the east and the Soviet lines and whatever waited for them there. And Bauer led his men onward toward the west and the Americans and whatever waited for them there. Altner wrote, "I watched those men walk away from us and I thought, they are going to die. All of them. That young officer knows it, and his men might know it, and they are walking toward it anyway because they do not have a Bauer. Because no one has stood in front of them and said out loud the thing that everyone already knows." I thought about that for a long time afterward. How much difference one person saying the true thing out loud can make. How many men walk into death simply because no one said the true thing? They reached the American lines on the morning of the 30th of April. Not all of them. 12 of the original 14. Bauer was one of the 12. Altner was one of the 12. They came out of the ruins with their hands up and their weapons on the ground, and they walked toward the American position in the gray morning light, and Altner wrote that he was shaking so badly he was not sure he could keep walking, not from fear of what was in front of them, but from the cumulative weight of everything that was behind them. 2 days of moving through a dying city, 2 days of calculation and shadow and fire and loss, and the constant presence of death as the most likely outcome of the next hour. The American soldiers who received them were from the 82nd Airborne Division. They were not gentle exactly, because gentleness was not a quality that the 82nd Airborne had spent the last several years cultivating, but they were correct. They were professional. They searched the prisoners efficiently and without unnecessary brutality. They separated them and began the processing that was the standard Allied procedure for prisoners of war. An American sergeant, a large man from somewhere in the American South, whose accent Altner could not place, but whose manner was unmistakably that of a man who had seen enough of war to have no interest in extending it unnecessarily, looked at the 12 men standing in front of him and said something in English that Altner did not understand. A German-speaking American soldier translated. The sergeant had said, "War's over for you boys. Sit down." Altner sat down. He sat in the dirt on the western edge of what had been Berlin and was now something else, something without a name yet. And he put his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a long time. He wasn't crying. He wasn't praying. He was doing something that he didn't have a word for in German or in any other language. Something that was simply the body's response to the sudden removal of an enormous and constant pressure, the physical reality of a man who has been holding himself together through will alone and has just been given permission to stop. Bauer sat beside him. After a while, without looking at him, Bauer said, "Write this down someday." Altner looked up. Bauer was looking at the sky, the gray April sky over what remained of Berlin, the smoke still rising from 100 fires, the sound of artillery still audible in the distance. Bauer said, Write down what it was actually like, not the version they will tell, the real version. The version where men are afraid and hungry and they make decisions in destroyed rooms with orange skies. And some of those decisions are the right ones, even though no one will call them that. Write that version. Altner did write it. Not immediately, not for years, but eventually. His memoir was published, and it stands as one of the most precise and unsparing accounts of what the final collapse of the Third Reich looked like from the inside, from the level of the men who were inside it. The men who were not in the bunkers and not in the history books, but who were in the streets and the buildings and the destroyed living rooms, making the calculations that determined whether they lived or died. Lieutenant Bauer's real name is obscured in the historical record. Altner changed some names to protect people, and this is one of the names he changed. But the man existed. The decision existed. The room with the orange sky and the child's drawing on the wall existed. The 12 men who walked out of Berlin with their hands up on the morning of April 30th existed. And their walking out was a consequence of one man standing in front of them and saying the true thing out loud, which was, "The orders are wrong, the war is lost, and I am not willing to lead you to your deaths for a cause that ended before we were given the orders to defend it." He spent the rest of the war in an American prisoner of war camp in France, and then in Germany itself as the Allied occupation took shape. The conditions were not comfortable. They were not meant to be comfortable, but they were survivable, which was a word that had taken on a weight and a specificity that Altner suspected it would carry for the rest of his life. He could write letters. He received letters. He ate. He slept without artillery. He watched the seasons change over the camp and felt the strangeness of being alive to watch them change, the strangeness of having a future, of being a person to whom tomorrow was not an abstraction, but an actual approaching event. He thought often about the young lieutenant he had seen in the factory building, the one going the other direction. He never found out what happened to him. He looked afterward in the records, in the lists of the dead and the survivors, and he could not find a match, which could have meant many things, and probably meant the thing he suspected it meant. He wrote about him once, near the end of his memoir, in a passage that is one of the most quietly devastating things in the book. He wrote, "I do not know his name. I know his face. I know the way he held himself, the way he looked at Bauer, the way he turned and led his men back toward the east. I think about him when I think about the difference between courage and obedience, between the man who says the true thing and the man who cannot. I think about him and I am grateful to Bauer in a way I cannot fully express, because Bauer said the true thing, and I am here, and the young lieutenant did not have a Bauer, and I do not know where he is." Helmut Altner went home to a Germany that was not the Germany he had left. He rebuilt his life in the slow, methodical way of his generation, the generation that had no choice but to rebuild because the alternative was to simply stop, and stopping was not something their bodies or their histories would allow. He worked, he married, he had children. He wrote his memoir, and he dedicated it, in a dedication that is only 2 sentences long, to the men who did not come back and to the men who made it possible for others to come back. Everyone who read it knew who the second dedication was for. Bauer, whoever he really was, whatever his real name was, the school teacher who had 2 daughters and who stood in a destroyed room in Berlin and said the true thing out loud when the true thing was the most dangerous thing possible to say. There is a moment near the end of Altner's memoir that stays with you after you close the book, or it stayed with Altner, which is perhaps the same thing. He is in the American camp. It is sometime in the summer of 1945. The war is over. The world is attempting to become something other than what it has been for 6 years, and Altner is sitting in the camp and he is watching the sky, just watching the sky. And he writes, "It occurred to me that I had not looked at the sky in a very long time without calculating what was in it, whether there were aircraft, whether there was smoke that indicated direction of fire, whether the color of it told me something I needed to know for survival. I had forgotten that the sky could simply be the sky, that you could look at it without needing anything from it. I sat there and I looked at it and I let it be just the sky. It took a while, but eventually it was." His name was Helmut Altner. He was 19 years old when the war ended. He came home. He wrote it all down exactly the way Bauer told him to, and the writing is still there in the pages of his memoir, precise and unsparing and true, the real version, the one where men are afraid and hungry and they make decisions in destroyed rooms, and some of those decisions, the ones made by men who are willing to say the true thing out loud, are the ones that let other men live long enough to watch the sky be just the sky.